modern superheroes.
Imagine a soldier bound by duty and surrounded by powerful forces who chose to risk everything to reveal the hidden truths within his own military unit. This is the story of Igor, a man who, when faced with corruption and intimidation, chose courage over silence. He knew the dangers all too well, yet he took a stand. Igor wasn't just another soldier. He was a person shaped by a fierce loyalty, not to his commanders, but to his principles. At a time when others might have stayed quiet, he chose to speak, despite walls of secrecy closing in and the relentless pressure to conform. He became a voice of dissent, a figure of quiet resistance, in a world where silence was enforced as the rule. What drives a person to take such risks? To confront powerful forces, knowing it could mean the end of life as they know it. For Igor, it was more than bravery. It was a sense of duty to others, soldiers who had been mistreated, extorted, and forced to endure an unjust system that saw them as expendable. Staying silent would have meant betraying these soldiers, and he couldn't allow that. Igor's story is proof that heroes aren't born, they're forged in moments of impossible choice. When it would have been easier to remain invisible, Igor made his choice. He chose to stand as a light against darkness, regardless of the price. In Igor's unit, corruption wasn't just a rumor whispered among soldiers, it was a fact of daily life. From the moment he entered, he saw the cracks in the system. Soldiers like him were forced to buy their own equipment, uniforms, and even basic supplies, paid for out of their own pockets. Those who dared to question it were met with indifference at best, and punishment at worst. Igor watched as officers openly demanded payments from soldiers. Money collected was supposedly for essentials, but few soldiers saw any improvements. Instead, these funds vanished into the hands of higher-ups, deepening the pockets of those in command. It was an unspoken rule. If you wanted to avoid dangerous assignments, or if you needed something as simple as medical care, you paid. Otherwise, you suffered. And it wasn't only about money. Igor saw soldiers threatened, intimidated, and sent into conflict zones with little regard for their safety. Those who objected, who tried to speak out, were punished. Some were demoted or isolated. Others were transferred to the most hazardous positions without proper support or equipment. The message was clear. Loyalty to the unit meant silence and submission. Dissent would not be tolerated. Igor was appalled by the disregard for human lives, the complete lack of accountability. He saw his comrades treated as expendable, mere numbers in a system that cared more about maintaining order than about protecting the people who served it. But what struck him most was the violence within. Violence that wasn't inflicted by an enemy, but by those on their own side. Officers who were meant to lead instead instilled fear, turning soldiers into shadows of themselves, afraid to challenge authority. Igor knew the risks of exposing this corruption. He understood the price of defiance. But with every instance of abuse he witnessed, his resolve grew stronger. He could no longer ignore the truth unfolding around him, and he knew he had to make a choice, one that would put him directly in the path of danger. Igor's story is filled with moments that defy belief. Imagine being a soldier not just fighting an external enemy, but also facing threats from within. Every day, Igor watched as officers demanded payments from soldiers, subtly hinting that those who didn't contribute would be reassigned to the most dangerous positions. These weren't empty threats. Soldiers who refused to pay up often found themselves in precarious assignments, placed on the front lines with minimal support and outdated equipment. But Igor refused to play along. When his superiors demanded that he pay for his own gear, he pushed back, questioning why a soldier serving his country should have to fund his own survival. This wasn't well received. His resistance marked him, setting him apart as someone unwilling to submit. Soon after, he began receiving warnings, thinly veiled suggestions that he fall in line. Yet Igor wouldn't be silenced, even as the threats intensified. At one point, he faced a direct confrontation with a superior who accused him of undermining authority. Igor was told, in no uncertain terms, that he was just a number, a soldier who could easily be reassigned to a more dangerous role if he didn't comply. It was clear that his life was considered expendable, a tool to be used and discarded. But this only strengthened his resolve. Then, there were the incidents that blurred the line between discipline and outright violence. Igor witnessed colleagues who spoke out dragged into brutal assignments or punished in ways meant to break their spirit. These men were often isolated, their complaints ignored, and their futures grim. Some returned battered, others never returned at all. And through it all, Igor continued to ask questions, determined to bring these injustices to light. The pressure mounted, yet he stayed firm, defying those who believed they could intimidate him. Each confrontation, each threat, only fueled his commitment to expose the truth. But with every step closer to revealing the full extent of this corruption, Igor knew he was risking everything: his career, his safety, and his life. How did he survive in an environment where speaking out was a dangerous act of rebellion? What choices did he make when he found himself standing alone against a powerful institution determined to silence him? Igor's story is one of courage and resilience in the face of impossible odds. And as he faced each new threat, he realized that he would have to confront far more than he ever anticipated. Igor Roshin didn't join the military for glory or power. Like many young men, he grew up with a deep respect for his country, raised on the ideals of loyalty, honor, and service. For Igor, enlisting was a way to protect the people he cared about, to contribute to something larger than himself. In his eyes, the military represented a noble institution, a place where values like courage and sacrifice were honored, where serving meant standing up for what was right. Before enlisting, Igor had built a life that reflected these values. He was known for his integrity, his dedication to his work, and his sense of responsibility. His family and friends saw him as someone who would do anything to help others. Joining the military, he thought, was the next step in that journey. He imagined himself becoming part of a brotherhood bound by a shared commitment to defend his homeland. Igor truly believed that his role as a soldier would be rooted in justice and service, driven by his genuine desire to make a difference. From the beginning, his motivations were pure. He wasn't driven by ambition or the promise of a steady paycheck. In fact, he had a stable job and a promising future outside of the military. But something inside him called him to serve, to protect, and to stand for the ideals he'd held since he was young. In his mind, the military was a place where those ideals could flourish, a space where he could contribute to something greater, something meaningful. But as he entered the ranks, Igor's expectations began to clash with reality. He found himself in an environment where loyalty was often measured not by integrity or dedication, but by obedience and silence. His idealism was met with harsh practices that contradicted everything he had believed the military stood for. Slowly, he began to see how the values he cherished were being twisted and used to enforce submission. His superiors weren't interested in service or honor. They were focused on maintaining control, often through means that conflicted with the very principles Igor had vowed to uphold. Yet, even as he started to recognize these troubling signs, Igor held on to the hope that he could make a difference. He wanted to believe that his ideals still had a place in this system, that maybe, with time, he could bring positive change from within. In those early days, he reminded himself of the reasons he joined. He clung to the belief that there was a purpose to his service, that his commitment to justice and duty would guide him, even in the face of mounting contradictions. Igor's story is, at its core, the story of a man who set out to serve with honor, only to find himself fighting for the very principles he thought he was protecting. As he navigated a system that betrayed his expectations, Igor's resolve was tested, pushing him closer to the realization that standing for what was right might mean standing alone. In his first few months of service, Igor noticed things that didn't sit right with him. At first, it was subtle, a sense that certain orders were questionable or didn't align with the training he'd received. Some commands seemed more about asserting control than about carrying out legitimate military objectives. Igor observed this in silence, chalking it up to his inexperience, thinking perhaps he just hadn't fully grasped the way things operated. But as time went on, the patterns became harder to ignore. He began noticing small, unsettling behaviors among his peers and superiors. Soldiers were being told to perform duties beyond their roles, often without the proper equipment or training. Men were reassigned with little warning, forced into positions they were unprepared for, and often at risk to their safety. Some of his comrades spoke quietly of favoritism, of certain individuals receiving benefits or avoiding dangerous assignments, while others were pushed to the front lines. But the favoritism was only the beginning. Igor soon realized that soldiers were being charged for supplies and resources that, by all rights, should have been provided by the military. Uniforms, boots, protective gear, basic necessities that any soldier would need were either outdated or in short supply, and those who wanted better had to pay for it themselves. For Igor, this was the first true fracture in his belief. How could an institution supposedly built on principles of honor and service exploit its own soldiers in this way? The more he observed, the more he felt a growing sense of unease. He watched as officers seemed to turn a blind eye to these injustices, or worse, took advantage of them for their own gain. There were whispers of superiors collecting funds for supposed unit improvements, yet nothing ever changed. The soldiers were still buying their own gear, still scrambling to make ends meet, and still risking their lives for a system that offered little in return. Then came an order that put everything into stark relief. Igor was assigned to a high-risk mission, despite his health limitations. When he raised his concerns, explaining that his condition could put himself and his unit in danger, he was met with indifference. His health didn't matter. What mattered was obedience. It was a moment that forced Igor to confront a painful reality. He was valued not as a person, not as a soldier with skills and limitations, but as a number, one more expendable asset in a vast impersonal machine. Igor struggled with this revelation. He wanted to believe in the institution he had joined, to trust that his leaders had his best interests at heart. But the more he witnessed, the clearer it became that loyalty in this place was a one-way street. His superiors expected unquestioning obedience, but they offered little respect or regard in return. The values that had driven him to enlist seemed hollow here, repurposed as tools of control rather than ideals to be upheld. It was a troubling realization. For a man who had believed in honor and service, who had thought he could make a difference, these red flags were devastating. He could no longer ignore what he was seeing, and the deeper he looked, the more he understood that his loyalty was being exploited. These early experiences planted the seeds of doubt in Igor's mind. He found himself at a crossroads, grappling with the realization that his duty might lie not in following orders, but in questioning them, even if it meant standing alone. For Igor, loyalty wasn't just a word, it was a guiding principle. He had joined the military believing that his loyalty to his unit and his country would be his greatest strength. But as he continued to witness the reality of the system he served, he found himself pulled in two conflicting directions. On one side was his sense of duty, the deep-rooted belief that his role as a soldier meant unquestioning allegiance to his unit. On the other side was his conscience, a voice that grew louder with each passing day, urging him to stand against the injustices he was seeing. It was a choice that weighed heavily on him, one he never imagined he would have to make. The more he saw, the harder it became to ignore. He thought about the men who stood beside him, soldiers who, like him, had joined with dreams of serving their country, only to find themselves caught in a system that seemed more intent on exploiting them than supporting them. Some of these men had families back home, loved ones who depended on them, and yet they were being forced into dangerous situations with little regard for their lives. It tore at Igor, knowing that these men were being treated as expendable, their loyalty repaid with neglect and abuse. His superiors, the very people who were supposed to protect and lead them, had become the ones to fear. There were whispered stories of soldiers who spoke up only to be punished, reassigned, or isolated until they fell back in line. Igor watched as good men were sent into high-risk assignments without the necessary support, their objections ignored, their concerns brushed aside. He understood that the system was designed to silence dissent, to keep men like him compliant and obedient, and he was beginning to understand the cost of challenging that system. Igor felt trapped. He wanted to do right by his comrades, to be the loyal soldier he had always envisioned. But how could he remain loyal to a system that betrayed its own men? How could he stand by as his friends were forced into impossible situations, knowing that their lives were treated as little more than tools for others to use? Every day, the internal conflict grew, gnawing at him, pushing him to a breaking point. He wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was he willing to sacrifice his safety, even his life, to stand against this corruption? Could he bear the burden of being the one to challenge a system that others had simply accepted? In quieter moments, he wondered if he was making a mistake, if he was letting his conscience lead him down a path that would only bring him pain. But then he would remember the faces of the men beside him, the ones who looked to him with a mixture of hope and fear, and he knew he couldn't turn away. Igor's choice to expose the truth became more than a matter of personal conviction. It became a moral responsibility. He understood that speaking out would make him a target, that those in power would not take kindly to his defiance. He would be risking not just his career but his life. Yet, for Igor, the thought of remaining silent was even more unbearable. He couldn't live with himself if he turned a blind eye to the suffering around him, if he allowed his comrades to be sacrificed for the benefit of a corrupt system. This was no longer just about him. It was about every soldier who had been mistreated, every life that had been put at risk by those who were supposed to lead. It was about standing up for the ideals he had once believed the military embodied: honor, integrity, and justice. In his heart, Igor knew that exposing this corruption was his only path forward, even if it meant walking it alone. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer, and he was prepared to face the consequences, no matter how severe. For Igor, this choice was deeply personal. It was a choice that would define him, not as a soldier following orders, but as a man standing for what he believed was right. In the face of a powerful institution determined to silence him, Igor's decision to speak out was both an act of courage and an act of defiance. It was a choice to honor his own values, to stand by his comrades, and to face whatever came his way with a clear conscience. Igor had always believed that serving in the military meant being part of something greater, a unit where everyone looked out for one another. But that belief shattered the day he discovered how deep the exploitation ran. It began with whispers among his fellow soldiers, rumors of forced payments, fees collected for everything from uniforms to equipment, demands that, at first, seemed like exaggerations. But as Igor looked closer, he realized these weren't rumors at all. They were the reality of life in his unit. One afternoon, Igor saw a young soldier being reprimanded for his uniform. The soldier explained that he hadn't been issued a replacement, that he had no choice but to wear what he had. But the officer wasn't interested in excuses. Instead, he told the soldier that if he wanted the proper gear, he would need to pay for it himself. The cost wasn't just money, it was a form of control, a way to ensure that soldiers complied, fearing the repercussions of speaking out. Igor was stunned. He had joined the military to serve, not to be treated like a pawn in someone else's game. As Igor began to ask around, he learned that this practice was widespread. Soldiers were forced to pool their meager paychecks to cover essentials that should have been provided by the military. Helmets, body armor, even basic medical supplies, all were withheld unless soldiers paid out of pocket. If they refused or couldn't afford to pay, they were left to fend for themselves, sent into dangerous situations without adequate protection. For Igor, this was a betrayal of everything he had been taught about service and honor. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was a systematic abuse of power. Higher-ranking officers demanded these payments with the implicit understanding that refusal would come with consequences. Soldiers who tried to resist were given the worst assignments, sent to the most perilous positions, or denied basic privileges. Those who complied, meanwhile, found themselves in slightly safer roles, their loyalty bought with promises that might offer temporary security, but at a tremendous personal cost. Igor's anger grew as he learned more. He realized that this wasn't just about a few greedy officers. It was a culture of exploitation embedded into the very structure of his unit. Young men who had signed up to serve their country were instead being used as revenue streams, their salaries siphoned away under the guise of necessary contributions. The money they gave didn't improve their conditions. It lined the pockets of those who were to protect them. He was particularly disturbed by the stories of soldiers who had refused to pay. These men were often reassigned to high-risk areas, placed on dangerous missions without adequate equipment. Some had even been sent into combat zones without proper armor or weapons, their objections dismissed as insubordination. Igor realized that the extortion wasn't just about money. It was about control, a way to keep soldiers compliant through fear and dependency. The more Igor uncovered, the more disgusted he became. He saw men stripped of their dignity, forced to pay for the right to stay safe. His comrades were being betrayed, their lives treated as collateral for the financial gain of a few powerful individuals. Igor's anger turned to determination. He couldn't stand by and watch as his fellow soldiers were used, their loyalty exploited, their safety compromised. Igor understood that exposing this would be dangerous. He knew that speaking out against the system could cost him everything. But his conscience wouldn't let him ignore what he had learned. The military he had once respected was not the institution he'd believed in. It was a system built on exploitation, where the very people who should have been leading were instead preying on those they commanded. This was a turning point for Igor. No longer could he justify staying silent, and no longer could he pretend that his loyalty to his unit required obedience to a corrupt system. He made a vow to himself that he would reveal the truth, no matter the personal cost. For Igor, the decision to expose these practices was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of justice, a stand for the men who, like him, had come to serve with honor, only to find themselves trapped in a web of corruption. Igor knew that staying silent would make him complicit. Armed with the knowledge of the extortion practices that had been bleeding his fellow soldiers dry, he decided it was time to confront his superiors. For Igor, this wasn't just about money. It was about the principles that had driven him to enlist in the first place. He couldn't watch as the men around him were forced to pay for basic supplies and safety, while those at the top looked the other way, or worse, profited from their suffering. He approached his commanding officer with a mix of determination and restraint, choosing his words carefully. He started with questions, trying to get a sense of how his concerns would be received. "Sir," he began, "why are the men expected to pay for their own equipment? Shouldn't these resources be provided by the military?" There was a pause, a flicker of irritation across his superior's face, but Igor pressed on. The soldiers deserve to know why they're being forced to use their own pay for supplies that should already be provided. The response he received was swift and cold. "Mind your place, Russian," his superior snapped. "It's not your job to question how things are done here." But Igor didn't back down. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath his calm demeanor, the frustration of seeing his comrades used and manipulated. He met his superior's gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. With all due respect, sir, the men deserve answers. They risk their lives every day, and they're being forced to pay out of pocket for basic safety. This isn't right. His superior's eyes narrowed, his tone darkening. Roshin, I suggest you watch yourself. You're treading on dangerous ground. But Igor wasn't deterred. He knew the risks, but his sense of duty to his fellow soldiers outweighed his fear. Sir, the men are being exploited. This isn't about loyalty, it's about abuse. They deserve more than this. They deserve respect. The room grew tense, his superior visibly struggling to maintain control. But instead of addressing the concerns Igor had raised, his commander's response shifted from dismissive to openly threatening. Roshin, he said in a low, menacing tone, you're stepping out of line. I suggest you keep these thoughts to yourself if you value your position here. Do you understand? Igor realized then that he wasn't dealing with simple indifference. He was confronting a system that would protect itself at any cost. His superior's warning was clear: speak out, and there would be consequences. But the threats only fueled Igor's resolve. He couldn't accept that fear and silence were the price of loyalty. He knew he was risking his place, his safety, even his future in the military. But he couldn't let go of his conviction that what was happening was wrong. Days after the confrontation, Igor felt the weight of the threats looming over him. He was reassigned to duties that kept him isolated, away from his usual post and his comrades. Whispers circulated among his peers, warning him to fall in line or face the consequences. Some tried to caution him discreetly, urging him to drop the matter for his own sake. But Igor couldn't ignore the anger and disappointment he felt. The very people meant to lead and protect them were exploiting their loyalty, treating them as expendable resources rather than men with lives and families. The tension grew with each passing day. His superiors monitored him closely, and he could feel their gaze on him, a constant reminder of the price he would pay for his defiance. But Igor couldn't bring himself to back down. The more he was pushed, the stronger his determination became. He knew that others were watching, that his actions had given some of his comrades a spark of hope, however faint. By standing up, he was challenging the unspoken rules, showing that the system could be questioned. Yet, he also understood that he was placing himself directly in the line of fire. His refusal to be silent made him a target, and the threats were no longer veiled. His superiors made it clear that his career, his safety, and possibly even his life were at stake if he continued down this path. But for Igor, there was no turning back. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to return to the silence he had once accepted. In confronting his superiors, Igor had ignited a battle that was far from over. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become a symbol of defiance within a system built on compliance. And as the days went on, he knew that every step he took brought him closer to a reckoning, one that would test not only his courage but the depth of his commitment to justice. Igor's decision to confront his superiors had set off a chain reaction, one that he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. He quickly found himself marked as a troublemaker, someone unwilling to accept the status quo. Almost immediately, the backlash began. Igor was reassigned to tasks far from his usual duties, isolated from the comrades he had served alongside. He was sent to remote posts where he was left alone for hours, with no one to talk to and little to do. It was a form of silent punishment, a reminder that his defiance would not go unnoticed. But it wasn't just isolation that he faced. Psychological harassment became a daily reality. His superiors began to criticize every minor detail of his performance, finding fault in things they had never cared about before. Tasks that had once been routine were now dissected and scrutinized, and even the smallest misstep was met with harsh reprimands. Igor felt the weight of their scrutiny bearing down on him, an unspoken warning that his life could be made very difficult if he didn't fall in line. The tension was relentless. He was moved to quarters that were isolated from the main camp, given schedules that kept him working odd hours, away from the rhythms of normal duty. His peers, many of whom had once stood beside him, now avoided him, fearful of being associated with someone labeled a dissenter. Conversations would fall silent when he entered a room, eyes turning away to avoid meeting his gaze. Igor felt the chill of isolation, knowing that his choice to stand up had left him entirely on his own. His superiors were methodical in their attempts to wear him down. They assigned him physically grueling tasks, knowing that he had a history of health issues that made such work especially taxing. It was their way of breaking him down, one day at a time. At night, exhausted and alone, Igor would reflect on the choice he had made. The doubt crept in slowly, gnawing at his resolve. He questioned if he had made a mistake, if his stand against corruption was worth the suffering he was now enduring. And yet, even in his lowest moments, there was a part of him that refused to be defeated. He reminded himself of why he had spoken out, of the faces of the men who were forced to buy their own protection, who had risked their lives in silence. That memory became his anchor, a small flame that kept him going even as the pressure intensified. But the harassment took a toll. His health began to suffer under the strain, and each day felt like a new battle. He was denied medical assistance for injuries sustained during his grueling assignments, told to tough it out as a reminder of his place. His complaints fell on deaf ears, his requests ignored. It was clear that his superiors wanted to break him, to make him regret ever questioning their authority. And as the days turned into weeks, Igor felt the weight of their efforts bearing down on him, slowly chipping away at his strength. The isolation was the hardest part. He was cut off from everyone, his support system dismantled, his friends too scared to reach out. He was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. The silence around him was deafening, a constant reminder that he had dared to challenge a system that demanded loyalty at any cost. And though he tried to stand strong, the loneliness was a constant presence, testing his resolve with every passing day. Through it all, Igor held on to one truth, that he would not be silenced. Even as the walls closed in around him, even as he became a shadow in his own unit, he knew that his choice to stand for what was right was something they could never take away from him. They could isolate him, harass him, and make him suffer, but they could not erase his commitment to justice. In the face of unrelenting pressure, Igor's spirit remained unbroken. His superiors had underestimated him, assuming that the threat of isolation and harassment would make him compliant. But Igor was not just fighting for himself. He was standing up for every soldier who had been silenced, every life that had been compromised by the corruption he had dared to expose. And even as he faced the consequences alone, he knew that his struggle was part of something bigger, a fight for integrity in a system that had lost its way. Igor had heard whispers of how dissent was handled in his unit, but nothing could have prepared him for the horrors he would witness firsthand. As his isolation continued, he began to hear stories about fellow soldiers who, like him, had questioned orders or resisted demands for payments. These men were not simply reassigned or reprimanded. They were subjected to brutal treatment meant to break their spirits, to send a message to anyone else who dared to step out of line. One evening, Igor heard a rumor about a soldier who had openly refused to pay for equipment. The soldier had been vocal, challenging his superiors about where the funds were going and why the men had to buy their own supplies. In response, he was assigned to a training exercise in a high-risk area without adequate support or protection. The message was clear. Those who resisted would find themselves in life-threatening situations, effectively abandoned by the people meant to lead them. And this wasn't an isolated case. As days went on, Igor learned of more incidents, each more disturbing than the last. One young soldier, just 18, had hesitated to follow an order he believed was reckless, endangering not only himself but his entire squad. The punishment was swift and brutal. He was humiliated in front of his comrades, stripped of his dignity, and reassigned to the most dangerous post in the region, a place where soldiers rarely returned unscathed. Igor was horrified to realize that disobedience was met not with disciplinary action, but with calculated cruelty, designed to instill fear in anyone who might dare to follow suit. The violence was both physical and psychological. Soldiers who resisted were often subjected to harsh treatment during exercises, pushed beyond their limits, or left without basic medical care. Igor witnessed men returning from assignments bruised and battered, the pain in their eyes a silent testament to the abuse they had endured. Some of them were unrecognizable, their spirits shattered, their loyalty eroded by the very leaders they had once trusted. Each encounter, each new story of abuse, deepened Igor's disillusionment. This wasn't the military he had envisioned, a place of honor and service. It was something darker, something corrupted beyond recognition. The most unsettling part was the silence. Soldiers who had suffered at the hands of their superiors kept their heads down, their voices hushed, fearful of what might happen if they spoke out. The fear was palpable, an unspoken agreement that everyone understood. Those who questioned orders, those who dared to challenge authority, would pay a heavy price. Igor could feel it weighing on him, a toxic atmosphere that smothered any sense of justice or integrity. He saw the toll it took on the men around him, men who once had been full of pride, now hollowed out by fear and betrayal. One night, Igor overheard two soldiers talking about a comrade who had disappeared after refusing to participate in a corrupt scheme. The official story was that he had been transferred, but the men knew better. They whispered about how he had been reassigned to a dangerous post on short notice, with little preparation and no support. Within days, news had come back that he hadn't survived the assignment. It was an open secret that the transfer had been a punishment, a way of silencing him permanently. Igor felt a chill run through him as he listened. This was more than discipline. This was a system that used fear and violence to maintain control. The more Igor witnessed, the more horrified he became. These weren't accidents or isolated incidents. They were deliberate acts of cruelty carried out by those in power to reinforce their authority. Igor had entered the military with a sense of purpose, a desire to serve and protect, but what he saw now was a twisted reflection of those ideals. His horror grew with each passing day, the realization dawning on him that he was part of an institution that preyed upon its own. Yet, amid the horror, Igor's resolve only strengthened. He knew now that speaking out wasn't just an option, it was a moral obligation. He couldn't stand by while his fellow soldiers were subjected to this brutality. The system had betrayed them all, treating them not as men but as tools to be used and discarded. And as Igor bore witness to the atrocities around him, he knew he could no longer remain silent. He would carry their stories with him, even if it meant risking everything to reveal the truth. As Igor continued to speak out, he felt the walls closing in around him. The system had a way of dealing with men like him, and he quickly found himself cut off, isolated from his peers. Those who had once been friends now avoided him, their glances filled with a mixture of fear and pity. His name became a warning whispered among the ranks, a reminder of what happened to those who questioned authority. It was clear that his superiors were determined to make an example of him. The isolation was deliberate. His assignments kept him far from the main group, away from familiar faces and places. He was reassigned to remote posts, given tasks that left him alone for hours on end. Each day, he felt himself slipping further from the camaraderie that had once sustained him. Conversations fell silent when he approached, and the warmth he had once shared with his comrades faded, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. Igor realized that he was being systematically erased, turned into an outcast to discourage others from following his example. But the isolation was only the beginning. The threats started subtly. A word here, a suggestion there. Superiors reminded him, often in veiled terms, of what could happen if he continued down this path. It would be a shame, one officer remarked, if a promising soldier like you ended up in a situation beyond his control. Igor understood the message. He was being warned, reminded that he could be reassigned to dangerous posts, where an accident might conveniently silence him. The psychological tactics were relentless. Tasks that were once straightforward became exercises in humiliation. Superiors would critique his work, no matter how meticulous, finding fault in the smallest details. They questioned his loyalty openly, insinuating that his defiance had made him unfit for service. Each day, Igor was reminded that he was alone, that his stance against corruption had made him an enemy in the eyes of those who wielded power. The personal toll weighed heavily on him. Nights became battles against his own thoughts, doubts creeping in as he lay in silence, wondering if he had made the right choice. He knew that his actions had isolated him, that he was paying a price for his refusal to stay silent. But he also knew that backing down now would mean betraying everything he stood for. Still, the loneliness was crushing, an unending reminder of how far he had drifted from the brotherhood he had once cherished. Igor had always known that standing up would come with consequences, but he hadn't anticipated the extent of the retaliation. The system wasn't just punishing him, it was trying to break him, to wear him down until he either fell in line or gave up entirely. And as the days wore on, he realized that the fight wasn't only against corruption, it was also a battle for his own sanity, a test of whether his principles could withstand the relentless pressure being forced upon him. Through it all, Igor clung to the belief that his actions had meaning, that his defiance, even if it left him isolated and endangered, was a stand worth taking. Yet with each passing day, the psychological weight grew heavier, and he found himself questioning how long he could hold out. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back. He was too deep in, and every threat, every calculated move to silence him, only strengthened his resolve to expose the truth. As the isolation and threats mounted, Igor found himself at a critical juncture, forced to confront the depth of his own resolve. Night after night, he lay awake, questioning the path he had chosen, weighed down by the risks he now faced alone. He knew that the easiest course would be to fall silent, to let the system continue unchallenged, to give in and escape the relentless scrutiny and intimidation. But each time he considered it, an undeniable truth pulled him back. He couldn't turn away. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Igor thought about the men he had served alongside, their faces, their struggles, their silent suffering under a system that treated them as disposable. He remembered the stories of extortion, the brutal consequences faced by those who dared to speak out, the young soldiers who were sent into harm's way as punishment for resisting. He felt their pain as if it were his own, and the injustice of it all stoked a fire in him that even the harshest threats could not extinguish. In that darkness, Igor found his answer. He couldn't control how others reacted, couldn't change the hostility of his superiors or the fear of his peers. But he could choose his own actions. He could choose to keep fighting, to keep pushing back against the corruption he had witnessed, to remain true to the values that had guided him from the beginning. His resolve solidified, stronger than ever, fueled by a fierce sense of responsibility, not just to himself, but to every soldier who had been mistreated, silenced, and ignored. Igor knew that his choice to keep going was dangerous, that his defiance would likely bring even more consequences. But his sense of purpose outweighed his fear. He realized that there was no victory in surrendering his principles, no peace in letting injustice prevail. His courage became his shield. His belief in what was right became the armor that protected him from the relentless pressure. Igor had reached a point of no return, and rather than retreat, he decided to step forward, unafraid of whatever lay ahead. To him, this was no longer just about survival. It was about honoring the loyalty and bravery of his fellow soldiers, about giving a voice to the suffering he had seen firsthand. It was about standing for something larger than himself, even if that stand cost him everything. In that moment, Igor understood that true heroism didn't come from a lack of fear, but from the strength to keep pushing forward despite it. With his mind clear and his heart resolute, Igor braced himself for whatever was to come. He had chosen his path, a path of courage, conviction, and unyielding moral strength. He was ready to face the darkness, to keep fighting for justice, and to bear whatever burdens would come, knowing that he could look himself in the mirror and stand proud. Igor Roshin was no longer just a soldier. He was a hero, defined not by his circumstances, but by his refusal to abandon his principles in the face of overwhelming opposition. Igor knew that to expose the truth, he would need to find allies outside the walls of his unit. Speaking up within the system had only led to isolation, retaliation, and silent threats. If he wanted his story to be heard, if he wanted real change, he would need to take his fight beyond the military's reach. But this decision wasn't easy. It was a leap into the unknown, one that carried risks he could barely imagine. For days, Igor quietly observed, keeping his plans close to his chest, looking for any sliver of opportunity to connect with someone on the outside. He understood the need for caution. The walls seemed to have ears, and even a careless word or a wrong look could draw unwanted attention. He knew he was being watched, that every move he made was likely under scrutiny. But his resolve outweighed his fear, and he began laying out his plan, piece by piece, with a meticulous focus born from necessity. The first step was finding someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't turn him over or dismiss his story as mere rumors. He remembered a contact from before his enlistment, a friend who had once been a journalist, known for his tenacity and unwillingness to back down. Igor had lost touch with him over the years, but he hoped that the man's sense of justice hadn't waned. Carefully, Igor wrote out his thoughts, planning how he would reach out without revealing too much, knowing that a single message in the wrong hands could jeopardize everything. Each night, Igor reviewed his plan, scrutinizing every detail, every step, imagining every possible outcome. He would need evidence, documents, testimonies, anything that could substantiate his claims. But gathering these without attracting attention would be a challenge. He began compiling what he could, making mental notes of incidents he'd witnessed, recalling names, dates, specific abuses. Each piece became part of his arsenal, a silent testament to the corruption he was determined to reveal. With every passing day, the weight of his choice grew heavier. He understood the enormity of what he was preparing to do. Speaking out meant defying not just his immediate superiors, but the entire institution he had once sworn to protect. It meant risking his career, his safety, and possibly even his life. The consequences were terrifyingly real, but the need to expose the truth was greater. He could no longer stay silent, not when so many others continued to suffer under a system that exploited and endangered them. As he neared the moment of action, Igor began to mentally prepare himself for the backlash. He knew that once he crossed this line, there would be no going back. The military would see him as a traitor, a defector, someone who had turned his back on his duty. He would lose friends, face accusations, and quite possibly be cast out entirely. But he also knew that his silence would be a greater betrayal, not just to himself, but to every soldier whose voice had been suppressed, every life that had been treated as expendable. With a sense of quiet determination, Igor gathered his courage, rehearsing in his mind the words he would say, the story he would tell. He reminded himself why he was doing this, why he couldn't simply look the other way. This was for the men who had been forced to pay for their own equipment, the soldiers who had been sent into dangerous situations as punishment for speaking out, the ones who had disappeared for questioning orders. He was doing this because, deep down, he knew that the true duty of a soldier wasn't just to follow orders, but to protect the integrity of those he served with. The final preparations were set. Igor knew the risks, understood that he was about to take a step that could never be undone. Yet, as he looked around at the faces of the men he had once considered brothers, he knew that he was making the right choice. He wasn't just exposing corruption, he was reclaiming his voice, his values, and his sense of justice. And with that, Igor steeled himself, ready to take his story beyond the walls that had sought to contain it. The day had come. Igor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that would forever alter his life. After months of gathering evidence, of questioning everything he once believed in, he was ready to reveal the truth. With trembling hands and an unyielding resolve, he connected with the journalist he had reached out to, the one he hoped would have the courage to bring his story to light. In that moment, he felt a mixture of fear and liberation, knowing that once he sent the information, there would be no going back. The journalist listened intently as Igor laid out his story, detailing the corruption, the extortion, the violence against those who resisted. Igor didn't hold back. He told of soldiers forced to pay for their own safety gear, of assignments given as punishment, of the lives that had been shattered by those in power. As he spoke, he could feel years of frustration and disillusionment pour out of him. Every word a condemnation of the system that had betrayed him and his comrades. Once the interview was completed, Igor's story spread quickly. News outlets picked it up, journalists began investigating, and within days, the details of the military's dark practices were exposed for all to see. Headlines questioned the integrity of the institution, sparking a wave of public outcry. People were horrified to learn that the very institution sworn to protect them had been exploiting its own soldiers, endangering lives for personal gain. The bravery it took for Igor to step forward became a focal point of the coverage, painting him as a hero in the eyes of the public. But the response from the military was swift and ruthless. Within hours, statements were issued denying the allegations, labeling Igor as a disgruntled former soldier, attempting to discredit the institution out of personal bitterness. They framed him as a traitor, someone who had violated the code of loyalty and duty. His name was dragged through the mud, his character attacked by those who saw him as a threat to their authority. The military painted him as a lone malcontent, someone willing to endanger national security for his own gain. Yet, despite the backlash, the story continued to gain traction. People were listening, questioning the official narrative. Fellow soldiers began to reach out discreetly, some with stories of their own, others simply to express their support. For every slanderous statement the military issued, there was another story, another soldier willing to confirm Igor's account, adding weight to his claims and proving that his story was not an isolated grievance, but a systemic issue that had been hidden for too long. The attacks against him became more personal. He received warnings, messages urging him to retract his statements, to think carefully about his next steps. He was accused of endangering his comrades, of undermining the unity and strength of his unit. The authorities made it clear that he was now an enemy, a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But Igor stood firm. He refused to retract a single word, to let fear or intimidation force him back into silence. Friends and family began distancing themselves, fearful of the repercussions that could come from being associated with him. Some offered words of caution, urging him to lay low, to let the story fade. But for Igor, there was no turning back. He had seen the cost of silence, the price of ignoring injustice, and he could not return to a life of compliance. This was his stand, his moment to prove that he was more than just another soldier. He was a man of conviction, a voice for those who had none, and he would not let fear dictate his actions. The public watched as Igor continued to hold his ground, his defiance becoming an inspiration to others. People admired his bravery, his willingness to sacrifice everything to reveal the truth. His story struck a nerve, and the public began to demand answers, to question the military's practices and the treatment of those who served. Igor's revelation had become more than just a headline. It had become a catalyst, a force that challenged the very foundation of an institution that had long gone unquestioned. As the days went on, Igor braced himself for the fallout. He knew the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, that the backlash had only just begun. But he also knew that he had done the right thing. In revealing the truth, he had chosen to stand on the side of justice, to honor the principles that had once led him to enlist. His story was out there now, a beacon of courage that shone brightly in the face of corruption, and he was ready to face whatever came next. In the days following the public revelation of his story, the threats against Igor escalated. The military and state authorities moved swiftly, determined to silence him by any means necessary. What had begun as veiled warnings and whispers turned into direct, unrelenting intimidation. Messages arrived daily, Some anonymous, others from officials, each one a reminder that he had crossed a line, one that could cost him everything. At first, the messages targeted only him, warning him to retract his statements or face consequences. But as Igor refused to back down, the threats began to touch those closest to him. His family, friends, and allies became targets. Late one night, Igor received a call from a close friend who had once served with him. His voice was tense, filled with fear. He told Igor that he had been questioned, pressured to distance himself, and reminded of the danger of associating with someone who had defied the system. The message was clear. Supporting Igor was a risk no one could afford. Igor's family faced similar pressure. His parents received unexpected visitors, officials who came under the guise of concern for Igor's safety, subtly implying that his actions could bring unwanted attention to his loved ones. The fear in his mother's voice was unmistakable when she told him about it, and Igor felt a surge of anger and guilt. He had known that speaking out would be dangerous for him, but he hadn't anticipated the extent to which the state would go to threaten the people he cared about. As days passed, the intimidation became more overt. Surveillance became part of his daily life. Unmarked cars parked outside his residence, unfamiliar faces following him wherever he went. At night, he received calls that hung up as soon as he answered, a constant reminder that he was being watched. The tension was suffocating, each moment filled with the looming presence of unseen eyes, waiting for him to slip, to show a moment of vulnerability. The state's attempts to isolate him extended to his allies in the press as well. Journalists who had covered his story found themselves harassed, their sources questioned, their personal and professional lives put under scrutiny. One of the reporters who had worked closely with him was suddenly transferred to a less visible position. Her career effectively stalled. Others received similar treatment, warned that continued coverage of Igor's story would come at a high price. The reach of the authorities was far and deep, a shadow that darkened the lives of anyone who dared to stand by him. Despite the pressure, Igor's allies held on, though he knew the cost they were paying. He felt the weight of their sacrifices, their courage in the face of intimidation, and he drew strength from it. But he also knew that their loyalty came at a personal risk, and that weighed heavily on him. Each threat, each phone call, was a reminder that his fight was no longer just his own. It had become a battle that endangered everyone who stood by him. The most chilling moments came late at night, in the silence of his empty apartment, when he would receive messages, some typed, others in ominous, clipped voices, reminding him that he had nowhere to hide. The state's tactics were clear: to break him, to make him feel as if he were alone, vulnerable and powerless against the forces arrayed against him. Yet, as frightened as he was, as intense as the threats became, Igor's resolve only grew. He had come this far, and he refused to let fear force him back into silence. But he also understood the stakes. The more he resisted, the more the authorities intensified their efforts, seeking any weakness they could exploit. They wanted him silenced, discredited, erased from the public consciousness. And if he didn't retreat, he knew they would stop at nothing to destroy him and those who remained by his side. The threats were more than just words. They were a constant, looming reminder that he was facing a battle where the costs could be everything. Igor braced himself, his mind racing with the risks he was now forced to navigate. He had always known this path would be dangerous, but the reality of it was harsher than he could have ever anticipated. His choice to stand against corruption had made him a target, not just for the state, but for every force that thrived within the shadows. And yet, even as the danger grew, he clung to his principles. He knew that his stand, his truth, was worth every threat, every moment of fear. He had set out to expose the darkness, and he would see it through, no matter how high the stakes climbed. As Igor's story continued to unfold publicly, it sparked powerful and mixed reactions across the country. On one side, he found unexpected support from people who saw him as a symbol of courage. Fellow soldiers, some of whom he had never met, began reaching out discreetly, sharing their own experiences and thanking him for speaking up. Some sent messages of solidarity, expressing admiration for his bravery and letting him know that they, too, had felt the weight of the system's corruption. For these soldiers, Igor's stand was a source of hope, a glimmer of justice in a world where silence had long been enforced. Among the messages of support, activists also took notice, rallying behind Igor as they sought to amplify his voice. Human rights groups and veteran organizations began to circulate his story, calling for investigations and reform within the military. Social media lit up with discussions, petitions, and campaigns, with people sharing his story and demanding answers. Igor had become a public figure, a man whose stand against corruption had ignited a spark in those who believed in change. The support was a lifeline for Igor, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in his fight. But alongside the support, there was also backlash, a harsh reminder of the risks he faced. Some people accused him of betrayal, of tarnishing the reputation of the military and undermining national security. High-ranking officials and media outlets aligned with the establishment began to paint him as a dangerous influence, a rogue soldier driven by personal grievances rather than any real sense of justice. They called him a traitor, a man who had turned his back on his comrades to pursue a selfish vendetta. In their eyes, he was destabilizing the very institution he had once sworn to protect. These attacks weighed heavily on him. It was painful to see his intentions questioned, his character dismantled by those who only knew his story from a distance. Friends he had served with grew silent, unwilling to speak up in his defense. Some feared the consequences of associating with him, while others genuinely believed the accusations against him, viewing his actions as reckless and dangerous. The isolation grew, pressing in on him from all sides, as the backlash turned former friends and allies into distant figures, afraid or unwilling to stand by him. The mixed response left Igor caught in a painful limbo. On one hand, the messages of support fueled his determination, reminding him that his fight mattered to people who had long been voiceless. On the other hand, the backlash cut deeply, leaving him feeling isolated, questioning how many people truly understood the depths of corruption he was trying to reveal. He felt like a lone figure caught between two worlds, one that saw him as a hero, and another that viewed him as a threat. Yet, despite the isolation and criticism, Igor found strength in those who continued to believe in him. He read and reread the messages from soldiers who had faced similar struggles, from civilians who admired his courage, and from activists who promised to keep his story alive. He knew that for every accusation of betrayal, there were voices that called him a beacon of integrity. These voices, though quieter than the backlash, were enough to keep him going, enough to remind him of the truth that had driven him to speak out in the first place. In the end, Igor accepted the reality of his position. He had chosen a path that few would understand, a fight that many were too afraid to join. The loneliness was real, the isolation sharp, but his resolve remained. He knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for those who had suffered in silence, those who had seen their loyalty manipulated and their courage disregarded. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a symbol, a man willing to stand alone if it meant exposing the truth. As the support and backlash continued, Igor held on to the belief that his journey was worth every sacrifice. He had become both celebrated and condemned, but through it all, he stayed true to his mission. He would carry on, facing the backlash, cherishing the support, and knowing that his choice to speak out had given voice to a truth that could no longer be ignored. The system's backlash against Igor reached a fever pitch. His story had shaken the foundations of an institution that thrived on secrecy and compliance, and those in power were determined to silence him once and for all. What began as subtle threats and attempts to discredit him quickly escalated into a full-force assault on his character, his integrity, and his very existence. First, the slander campaign intensified. Government-aligned media outlets published articles casting doubt on Igor's story, labeling him as unstable and untrustworthy. They painted a picture of a man who had failed to adapt to military life, implying that his accusations were fueled by resentment rather than any real desire for justice. Reporters, some of whom had never met him, dissected his background, looking for any flaw, any misstep, to twist into evidence that he was unreliable. Headlines accused him of having ulterior motives, of undermining the nation's security for personal gain. Igor watched as his reputation, once defined by loyalty and courage, was dragged through the mud by those who barely knew him. But the slander wasn't enough. As Igor continued to stand by his claims, the threats against him escalated. He began receiving disturbing messages, both anonymous and direct, warning him that he was endangering not just himself, but everyone he cared about. Some threats were vague, promises that he would regret his decision. Others were explicit, detailing the ways he could be hurt or made to disappear. Igor couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted, each message a reminder that he was fighting forces far more powerful than himself. Yet, even as the threats mounted, Igor refused to be intimidated. But the system was relentless. They moved beyond words, targeting him with physical intimidation. Unmarked cars trailed him wherever he went, lingering outside his apartment late into the night. He would find unknown figures watching him from a distance, their faces shadowed, their presence a silent warning. When he walked down the street, he could feel eyes on him, an invisible presence that followed his every move, making it clear that he was never truly alone. One night, the intimidation turned violent. As Igor was returning home, he felt a sharp shove from behind. He stumbled, barely catching himself, only to realize that two men were closing in on him. They didn't speak, their faces cold and expressionless as they grabbed him and pushed him against a wall. "You've made a mistake," one of them muttered, his voice low and threatening. Igor felt the sting of fear as they made it clear that this was a warning, a demonstration of what could happen if he didn't back down. The men left as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Igor shaken, bruised, and painfully aware of the lengths to which his enemies were willing to go. The physical threats didn't end there. His apartment was broken into, his belongings tossed around, though nothing was taken. It was a message, a reminder that he was vulnerable, that his life could be invaded at any time. Igor felt a chill settle over him, a realization that the people he was up against would stop at nothing to discredit, intimidate, or harm him. Every sound outside his door, every unknown face in a crowd became a source of dread, each a potential threat in a battle he couldn't control. Despite the fear, Igor's resilience only grew. He understood now that this fight was not just about exposing corruption. It was about surviving a system that sought to destroy him. Every attempt to break him, every act of intimidation, became fuel for his resolve. They could threaten him, attack him, try to dismantle his life piece by piece, but they couldn't force him to betray the truth. Igor had become a man who had nothing left to lose, a man whose strength came not from physical power but from an unbreakable commitment to justice. And though he felt the weight of each threat, the vulnerability of standing alone against an entire institution, he refused to yield. The climax of his fight had arrived, a storm that tested the very core of who he was. But Igor was not broken. He was battered, bruised, and marked by the violence and intimidation, but his spirit remained unshaken. In the face of the strongest retaliation yet, Igor stood firm, a beacon of resilience against the darkness that sought to consume him. Despite the relentless threats, the intimidation, and the attempts to break him, Igor remained resolute. He knew he could end it all. Call off the media, retract his statements, disappear from the public eye. All he would have to do was recant, to say that he had been mistaken, that his accusations were exaggerated. The system offered him this choice in subtle ways, hinting that his life could return to normal if he simply corrected his story. But for Igor, there was no going back. The truth he had revealed was too important to erase. Every time he considered his options, his mind went back to the soldiers who had reached out to him, those who had suffered under the same corrupt system, those who had paid dearly for speaking up. He remembered the young men who had been forced to pay for their own protection, who had faced punishment for asking questions, who had been silenced before they even had a chance to resist. Their stories, their sacrifices, were etched in his memory, each one a reason to keep going, to stand by his testimony no matter the personal cost. The authorities doubled down, hoping that the strain would eventually wear him down. But each day, as they intensified their efforts, Igor's defiance only grew stronger. In interviews and statements, he spoke clearly and unapologetically, repeating the truths he had shared from the beginning. He didn't soften his words or compromise his message. He knew that by standing firm, he was inviting more backlash, but his principles would not allow him to waver. For Igor, this fight had become a matter of honor, of keeping faith with the men who could no longer speak for themselves. As the pressure mounted, he received offers from others who were willing to help, people who admired his courage and wanted to support his cause. Activist groups reached out, human rights organizations expressed interest in his case, and journalists continued to cover his story, refusing to let the public forget. Despite the powerful forces aligned against him, Igor found himself with allies who believed in him, who saw him not as a renegade or a troublemaker, but as a hero standing for justice. The system tried one last tactic. They attempted to turn the public against him by accusing him of destabilizing the nation, of creating chaos and distrust. They argued that his actions were irresponsible, that his defiance was undermining the very structure of the military. Some voices in the media echoed these accusations, painting him as a man willing to sacrifice national security for his own agenda. But Igor knew that these were desperate attempts to silence him, to turn the public away from the truth he had revealed. He held his ground, countering each attack with calm and clarity, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. In the quiet of his own thoughts, Igor sometimes wondered about the cost of his defiance. He knew that his life would never return to what it had been, that he would forever be marked by this choice. But even in those moments of doubt, his resolve remained unshaken. He reminded himself that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to press on despite it. His path was no longer about survival or reputation. It was about standing as a testament to integrity, as a voice that could not be silenced by threats or slander. Igor's stand became more than a personal fight. It became a symbol. People began to see him as a man who had dared to challenge a powerful institution, a soldier who had chosen to honor his beliefs over his safety. His defiance was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there were those willing to risk everything to stand for what was right. He inspired others to speak up, to question, to hold their own institutions accountable. In his defiance, he had become a beacon of strength, a figure who embodied the power of resilience and integrity. And so, despite every attempt to silence him, Igor continued to speak, to resist, to stand firm. He knew that the battle was far from over, that the path he had chosen would be filled with challenges he could scarcely imagine. But he also knew that his story, his voice mattered. It was a light in the darkness, a truth that would not fade. No matter the cost, Igor Roshin had chosen to remain steadfast, a hero not because he was without fear, but because he refused to let fear rule him. In the wake of Igor's courageous stand, the impact of his story rippled across the country, sparking discussions, investigations, and a new awareness of the corruption embedded within the military. His revelations had cast a light on practices long hidden in the shadows, and now the public demanded answers. Authorities faced mounting pressure to address the issues Igor had exposed, and soon, calls for reform echoed from every corner of society. His bravery had forced a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. Investigations were launched, some reluctantly, others with genuine intent. High-ranking officials were questioned, and a few key figures implicated in Igor's accounts were quietly removed from their positions. Public scrutiny led to promises of change within the military, a commitment to better oversight, a vow to ensure that soldiers would no longer be forced to fund their own protection or face punishment for questioning unethical practices. While the promises were cautious and the changes slow, there was a shift. Igor's story had planted a seed, a small but undeniable step toward accountability. The effect extended beyond the walls of the military. Civilian organizations took note, recognizing the need for greater transparency in all institutions. Igor's actions became a case study in courage, an example of how one voice could force a powerful institution to confront its own failings. His story was shared in classrooms, discussed in community centers, and honored by activists who saw him as a symbol of integrity. The phrase, "Be like Igor," became a rallying cry for those who believed in standing against injustice, no matter the personal cost. But for Igor, the aftermath was bittersweet. He had paid a high price for his stand, enduring threats, isolation, and the loss of friendships he had once held dear. The life he had known was forever changed, and he often reflected on the sacrifices he had made to expose the truth. Yet, even in his moments of doubt, he found solace in the knowledge that his courage had made a difference. His actions had given others a voice, had sparked conversations that needed to happen, and had brought a level of accountability that would have otherwise been buried. As he moved forward, Igor chose to use his experiences to inspire others. He began speaking out about the importance of integrity, of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. People looked to him as a guide, a man who had faced down an institution and refused to back down. He received invitations to speak at events, to share his story with young soldiers, activists, and civilians alike. He became a mentor to those who found themselves in similar situations, helping them navigate the challenges of standing up against powerful forces. Over time, Igor found a new purpose in his role as an advocate for change. His story continued to resonate, reminding people of the cost of silence and the value of speaking up. His courage had transformed not only his own life, but the lives of countless others who saw in him a figure of resilience. Igor had not set out to be a hero, but his actions had made him one, a symbol of hope and strength in a world that often rewarded conformity over courage. Looking back, Igor understood that while the reforms and investigations were important, the true value of his actions lay in the awareness he had raised. People now questioned, they demanded transparency, and they held those in power accountable in ways they hadn't before. His story had become a beacon, a reminder that change was possible, that courage could indeed inspire others to break the silence and seek justice. In the end, Igor's legacy was not defined solely by the actions he had taken, but by the impact he had left on the hearts and minds of those who had heard his story. He had shown that one voice could make a difference, that the pursuit of truth, though fraught with hardship, was a path worth taking. Igor's journey was far from over, but as he looked toward the future, he did so with a sense of peace, knowing that his courage had created a lasting change. As Igor looked back on his journey, he felt the weight of every choice he had made, every risk he had taken. He had started as a soldier, driven by a desire to serve with honor, never imagining that his path would lead him to stand alone against a powerful institution. But through every trial, every threat, and every moment of isolation, he had discovered something profound. That true courage wasn't found in the absence of fear, but in the resolve to act despite it. Igor understood now that his fight for justice had been more than a personal quest. It was a commitment to the ideals he had once believed the military embodied: loyalty, integrity, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. He had seen those values twisted and used as tools of control, but in standing up, he had reclaimed their true meaning. He had shown that honor and bravery didn't require blind obedience. They required a willingness to speak out when something was wrong, even when it came at a high cost. Reflecting on the impact his story had made, Igor felt a sense of peace. He knew that his actions had come at a price, that the life he had once imagined would never be his. But he also knew that his choice to reveal the truth had inspired others, that his journey had given people the courage to stand up in their own lives. He had lit a spark, a reminder that one person's integrity could ripple outward, challenging systems, changing minds, and inspiring others to break free from silence. Igor believed that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be systems that needed reform, powers that needed to be questioned, and injustices that needed to be brought to light. But he also believed in the power of individuals to create change, to stand as beacons of hope and resilience. His journey was a testament to the strength found in ordinary people who dared to believe that their voices mattered. In a world that often rewarded compliance, Igor had chosen courage, and in doing so, he had proven that heroism didn't require fame or recognition, only an unwavering commitment to the truth. As he looked toward the future, Igor hoped that his story would continue to resonate, that others would see in his actions a call to stand for what was right, no matter the challenges they faced. He knew that bravery wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet resolve to do what needed to be done, to protect what was just and true, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Igor's journey had shown him the power of integrity, the strength of resilience, and the enduring importance of fighting for justice. And as he took his next steps, he carried with him a deep conviction, a belief that every person, no matter their position, had the potential to make a difference. His story was not just his own, it was a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to stand for something greater than themselves.